All right, so here's some stuff that you guys need to think about. Thing number one, you turn in the book review. I'm gonna grade on Wednesday and Friday. The goal is to get all this done by Friday. If it's accepted, you'll get points. If it's not accepted, you'll get a 0, and I'll send you an email or put a note in the, what is that thing, rubric, that tells you what source I think you plagiarized from, because that's typically the only reason that I wouldn't give you some points on your book review. Because even I've had a couple where people didn't follow any of the directions at all, but it was clear that they read the book. So they said some stuff about the book. So, you know, that kind of worked out, even though it didn't follow the directions of the assignment. Thing number two, somebody was asking help for the weekly questions. We'll talk about the weekly questions here in a minute, but I made a separate video about the Reagan question because somebody asked me to. So if you watch that, that should be helpful. I mean, that was the reason I made that. So, and I've gone over it a little bit in class. We'll go over a little bit today. But there's a separate video that I sent you the link to. And if you didn't see the link, and it goes to your ACC email, so I know it all gets, you know, it gets sent there. It's just you have to check the ACC email. And if for whatever reason you don't check that, look in the on the Blackboard side and look on the announcement part, okay? So check that out. And, you know, whoever it is that asked about that, don't worry, because you are not the only person that didn't see it. So you're the person that, you know, got it out there that you need to check for it. So don't worry about that at all. Also, apparently I'm cranky because somebody sent me, not from your class, another class. It's like, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but so you know, apparently I've told people don't be disrespectful in your email. I have gotten a couple of rude emails like, what in the world are you doing? How can you miss this? You know, are you stupid? That sort of thing. Those things typically aren't helpful is all I'm trying to say. Because if you want something from me and you're insulting me at the same time, I'm just saying it's a bad plan. I'm not saying like I'm not going to read your email and I'm going to ignore you. I'm just saying, you know, if you're kind of a jerk to me and you need 1 point to pass, I don't know about that 1 point. It makes it easier for me to give you that 1 point if you're, you know, not being turdy. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying don't ever ask questions or don't ask about your grades. I'm just saying, what is it your old relatives say, that you get more flies with honey than vinegar? And I know you don't really want any flies, but being kind gets you a better result than being a jerk, except like at the service desk at Target or Walmart. And I get it. If you're a jerk, sometimes they give you what you want just to shut you up. But we're not at the service desk, and I don't have to, you know, I won't have a manager who comes over and tells me like, just give them what they want so they'll shut up. I don't have one of those bosses here. I'm not going to say maybe I had one of those when I taught high school, but I don't have one here. So I'm just saying, you know, ask whatever you like. You're fine. So don't feel like you can't ask stuff. And I apologize if I made you feel that way. Be sure and ask any question that you have. And even if I've already answered it, I'll answer it again. I may say like, oh, don't forget to check your syllabus, but I'll try not to be, you know, I don't want to be a turd to you just because, you know, because maybe I can, but I don't know. I can't. I don't want to. All right. Thing number 3, I don't know if there's oh yeah. I had a bunch of people, not necessarily from this class, but 2 or 3 probably from each class, asking how they can figure out what their grade is. And I tried to explain it, but I don't know if I just did a poor job or you guys had a lot of turkey. You know, I don't know what's going on. So figuring out your grade. So let's say that you would like to pass this class, which I assume you all would. And for everybody's purposes, yours, dual credit, college, whoever, you need a C. So you need 210 points total. You have 70 points remaining plus the book review. And if you didn't do the book review, clearly those points are not available. But it's fine. You didn't have to do the book review. So let's say that right now you have 170 points. Let's just say that. So you need 210. So you do a little bit of math. 210 minus 170, 210, 170, that leaves you what? 40. 40 points. So you need 40 points to get a C. There's 70 points available. So you just need 40 out of the next 70. That's very doable. So you're in good shape if you're, in that spot. So do the math and, take the point total from what you want, subtract what you have from what you want, and that'll tell you how many points you need to get. Now, if you want an A, you had to do the book review. I really tried to make that clear. So hopefully you got that. And I know also there are more than 300 points available, but we're figuring it on a 300-point scale. So 210 for the C, 240 for the B, 270 for the A. Anything below 210 is not going to be useful for you. So hopefully you're in a good spot as far as those things go. As far as turning stuff in late. So here's our problem coming up with late. My grades are due when they're due. So you can't turn stuff in too late. You just can't. And even if, well, I haven't turned anything in late and you said I can turn in 2 things late, I did say that. However, when my grades are due, they're due. And it's not like high school where we'll all see each other again in the spring and I can just go to the registrar and say like, hey, will you fix this grade? Changing a college grade is an act of Congress, and I have to have a better reason than, they just didn't feel like finishing it on time. Okay, so your stuff is due on Friday, December 11th. Okay, that's really when you need to have it turned in. Earlier is even better, but that's really when you need to have it turned in. My grades are going to be due 5 o'clock on Tuesday, December 15th. After probably about noon on Tuesday, December 15th, I probably don't want any papers from you. And I don't want a bunch of stuff from you on Tuesday, December 15th. If you're turning in one thing, I can probably live with it. If you're trying to turn in all your weekly questions and do the quiz, not cool, not cool, okay? So try to do stuff on time, even if you haven't used up your 2 late grades yet, okay? And if you've already turned in 2 late things, really, come on, guys, be on time. You know, and it's due. All right, I had to look at my phone because I don't remember the due dates. I mean, I know what day of the week it is, but all right. Let's look at the weekly questions. Let's see. Weekly question. There we go. All right, weekly questions. Here we go. The first one was analyze the success of Reagan's administration, both domestic and foreign policy. Explain why he left office popular with the public despite leaving behind an enormous national debt, for that time period. We'd gladly have that national debt back now. But I've graded a few of these because like 6 or 8 people have turned them in, not in your class, but in all 3 classes. But it's not super popular to do stuff early, but some of you are. Here's the thing that I've noticed. You're ignoring the last part of the question. Explain why he left office popular with the public despite leaving behind an enormous national debt. So don't forget to answer that part. Also in the first part, successes in domestic and foreign policy, be specific. Don't just say he built up the military, he made us proud to be Americans, the economy improved. Tell me that unemployment went from 12% to 6%, or those numbers aren't accurate, by the way. Or that inflation went from 17% down to 4% or something like that. Explain specific numbers or details, or talk about laws that were passed, that sort of thing. Okay? I know there's some intangible things about Reagan that people like, and you're welcome to mention those things too. But I'm always wanting some evidence that you learned something specific, or that you at least know where in the book to find something specific. So don't forget that stuff. Not today's question really, but this chapter's question, which we'll talk more about on Thursday, Bush commented in his 2001 inaugural address that America had gone out into the world to protect, not possess, and to defend, not to conquer. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Give examples to support your position. Now, I recognize this is a George Bush question, kind of, sort of. However, he's making this statement at his inaugural address. So you are welcome to talk about things that happened before Bush became president, because inaugural address is your first day on the job. So he's not saying he's done this, that, or the other thing. He's saying previous to his administration, this is how our foreign policy was carried out. So you can talk about, you know, were we protecting and defending when we entered World War II, when we entered the Korean conflict, when we entered Vietnam, or you can make it really recent to the Bush presidency and talk about stuff we did in the Reagan, old Bush, and Clinton administration. And we surely send the troops a lot of places in the Clinton and the Bush administration a little bit, but the Clinton administration quite a bit, and also some in the Reagan. So you can feel free to talk about stuff that happens before the Bush administration. You could honestly talk about stuff that happens during the younger Bush administration if you like, but don't feel like you have to, because he's really just kind of at the end of this chapter and then at the beginning of the next. So it's really more about the statement. Also, when you talk about whether you agree or disagree with the statement, you have to acknowledge something about the other side of the argument. So don't just say, this is completely wrong, he's an idiot for saying this, because I'm betting that I could find at least one instance in US history where it looks like we sent troops in to help somebody and it wasn't in our own best interest. I'm guessing I could find a couple times during the Clinton administration where I think that's probably true. So that's part of the reason that this question's being asked. There are times when we send in troops in a way, or we do something in a way that seems like maybe it's just to help people. Other times it might be to clear the way for the oil trade, or to, you know, save, I don't know, save some person like the Shah of Iran or something like that. So acknowledge the other side, even though you're primarily arguing, one side rather than the other. And then the third question, the problem that I'm seeing with the couple of people that have already turned this in, is they're comparing Barack Obama and Donald Trump's presidencies rather than their campaigns. So don't forget that the question's really about the campaign. So when you're answering this one, and we'll talk about this next week, I would talk more about how they use technology, how they raised money, and how they advertised in campaigns. You know, what's different about how they do stuff, who they appeal to. And what I think is fascinating about these two folks, as far as techniques and message, that kind of thing, is there is a cross-section of voters who voted for both Obama and Trump because they wanted to see change. So what is it about these two guys that suggests that they can bring in a change that other candidates could not bring in? Because Obama and Trump, I don't know if you have analyzed them very much, but I think if you've just paid a very little bit of attention, you've probably noticed they're not much alike. So it is interesting to me, and a lot of other political historians, that there's a cross-section of voters that both of these guys appeal to, and they're guys who want change. So what is it about these two guys that scream change, aside from, their slogans? Because Barack Obama said hope and change. You saw the picture probably, or the campaign poster. And then Donald Trump was going to drain the swamp, so which is change as well. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Why do we have to say that we're stopping the sharing when we're old? All right, do you guys have any questions about the weekly questions at this point? And yeah, look for the video on the YouTube page. I did send a link, but I think you can find it even if you don't have the link, if you just go to the YouTube page. All right, let's start talking about whoever we're talking about today, Bush and the other fellow. The other fellow would be Clinton, Bush and Clinton. All right, notes, I say notes. All right, sorry for the scroll there. Hopefully that didn't make you dizzy. All right, so last we spoke a little bit of Ronald Reagan, maybe not enough, which is why I made the little extra video, but just general things about Reagan. He made it cool to be a Republican again. That's kind of the way Republicans saw it. I know some of you are going like, of course it's cool to be a Republican. And others of you are going like, it's never cool to be a Republican. So depends on your perspective. But he really kind of rebuilds the brand, if you will, of being a Republican after it may have been harmed a little bit by the Nixon-Ford administrations. And Ford, not necessarily intentionally, he wasn't necessarily corrupt, but, when he pardoned Nixon, who might have been corrupt, it looked a little bad. So Reagan makes it acceptable to be a Republican again. The book Foner is going to talk about how he probably wasn't as conservative as Republicans hoped he might be. And he certainly was more conservative than liberals thought he should be. But as far as his personality and the way he campaigned and his speaking ability, he was fairly acceptable in those ways. A few scandals, of course, the big one being the Iran-Contra scandal, which may have tarnished his image on the way out. We didn't really talk about this. It mentions it in the book some as well. Excuse me for one sec. Sorry. I think I've been completely silent for a week. I've talked all day, so it's kind of tiring. Reagan. What was I going to say about Reagan? Oh, yeah. At the end of his presidency, he seemed to have a few of these little gaffe sort of things where, it seemed like he was a little confused about some stuff. Now, he was older, and at that point, we hadn't had a very old president. I think he was late 60s. Maybe I should double check to tell you this, but the current president we have and the future president we have, both older. So, we've had older people since then, but Reagan was the oldest president we'd had to that point. And, we thought, well, he's just getting a little older. Turns out he had the beginning of Alzheimer's. So he was born in, let's see, 1911 and left office in 1989. So that sounds like he was 70? Was he that old? Yeah, I guess he was. All right, so 78. I know you're going like, is she not good with math? No, she is not good with math. Okay, but I think, let's see, Biden he'll be 80 on his next birthday, I think, or maybe 79. And then Trump he's a little bit younger, like 2 years younger. So, but we hadn't had an old guy, like a super old. Sorry if I just called Trump and Biden super old guys. But we hadn't had a super old guy as president. And the end of the second Reagan term, he was pretty old. So he was at the beginning of Alzheimer's and then announced that a couple of years after his presidency ended. So, and at the beginning of that, I don't know if you've had relatives or you've read much about this. At the beginning of that, it's not, the president doesn't run the country by himself. And it, especially in that era, probably took a little while for them to figure out what it was, even though I know he has really, really good medical care. If you're the doctor or the president, you have a really good staff of doctors. And he was at the end of his term, so they may have thought it would be destabilizing, and I don't know. And even to this day, we probably don't know how serious the issues were, but it was a little scandalous once we found out, but then people also liked him so much that mostly they just felt sad. So I was like, oh, that's a shame. Okay. But I don't know that you necessarily, when you're writing your Reagan answer, that I don't know that he remained popular because people felt sorry for him because he was sick. I wouldn't put that in there because that we didn't know that immediately at the end of his term. So, all right, so Reagan's gone, but his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and I will sometimes politely refer to him as Old Bush because we have the older one and the younger one. And they're both George. One is George W., the other George Herbert Walker, George H.W. So Dad, Bush, is going to run for president. And he primarily gets elected because he's Reagan's vice president. And we liked Reagan, so we figured Bush will be kind of the same. He promised to bring in an era, like a kinder, gentler era, and that we would have 1,000 points of light where people would volunteer more. So, you know, he's trying to be like Bush, but not Bush, I'm sorry, Reagan, but a little softer, a little more not personable. Reagan was certainly personable, but the kinder, it's the idea, kinder, gentler. He talked about that a lot. So, and that's sort of interesting given his background. He's a World War II veteran, not saying that veterans can't be kinder and gentler, but he had kind of a tough image in some ways, although certainly personally nobody thought he was, as far as I know, people didn't think he was a jerk or rude or anything. But he'd been a World War II pilot and a war hero. He had been the head of the CIA, which isn't normally a hugging position as we think of it. And he'd been the ambassador to China. He'd also been a senator. Clearly, he'd been a vice president. So this is a well-qualified fellow. And he runs against, who did he run against? 92. He ran against, crud, why can't, oh, I know who it was. It was that guy from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. It's Michael Dukakis, who was an accomplished fellow from a fairly well-known family in Massachusetts. His mom was a famous actress from her generation. I know you're going like, no, I don't know who she is. Yeah, because you're young. Olympia Dukakis. I think she might still be alive. I don't know. She was in, so I knew who she was, and I didn't watch a lot of movies. She was in Moonstruck. If you've ever seen that, I don't know why you would have. And she was in Steel Magnolias, which if you're older and from the South, apparently you have to watch. So she's an older, really blonde woman, and she's very Greek looking. She's, if that, oh, can I say that? I apologize if I can't say that. But she, and the name, of course, Dukakis probably sounds Greek, maybe. All right. But because he wasn't in the military and kind of tried to portray himself as a little tougher, he looked like he was playing, and George Bush is pretty comfortable in his own skin. And I don't know, we liked Reagan. So Bush is kind of a shoo-in. Okay, Bush gets elected, and pretty quickly in the first term, the folks from Iran, led by Saddam Hussein, decide that Kuwait is their 13th province, and so they invade it. The people in Kuwait decide that they're not Iraq's 13th province. So they go to the United Nations and say, hey, United Nations, we are not Iraq's 13th province. So perhaps you could help us get these Iraqis out of our country. And so the US devises, compiles, creates, that might be better, a UN coalition, and almost every major nation joins it. I feel like maybe it was, I think the Soviets were a little slow on joining, but almost every major nation does join. And the idea is they're going to push Iraq out of Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein's like, no, it's our 13th province. And then after 3 months of bombing and then a few days of ground troop movements, Iraq is pushed out of Kuwait. Now, the US has learned some things about covering wars from Vietnam, because the war coverage probably made the American public a little less likely to support the Vietnam conflict than more likely. So, sorry for the yawn. Oh, apologies. So they embedded reporters. They sent reporters with different troops, with different troop movements, and they made sure that the reporters were in places where they were going to see successful things going on. Plus, honestly, it's the United States and a bunch of other nations fighting Iraq. So it's going to turn out well. Also, they made sure that the reporters were, say, in the plane dropping the bombs rather than on the ground near the bombs. So that way what was covered and what was filmed was positive and not terribly gruesome. So I remember watching the war on television, and the way that they showed things made it look a little more like a video game. So you got to see from the pilot's perspective, you got to see the radar or the guiding software showing the bomb hitting, and then you saw kind of a poof, but you didn't see anyone getting hurt, or you didn't see any blood or anything like that. So it was like an older video game. It wasn't even like, yeah. So it was kind of a sanitized war, if that makes any sense. It was very popular because it was fast, because it had international approval, and because there was nobody that felt sorry for Saddam Hussein because he was terrible. I know that's not a good thing to say in a history class because it didn't sound very neutral, but he was terrible. If you disagreed with him, he had you killed. He had like a wood chipper, shredder that he put people into. He's just horrible. I mean, he was a dictator, and he had people killed, and he tortured people, and he was bad. So there's nobody that says, like, you know, we really shouldn't support him. Plus, he wasn't defending his own country. He'd taken over the neighbors. So there's really nothing supportable about Saddam Hussein. And the only people who complained about the US-UN action were the it's none of your business kind of people. Let those two countries sort of sort it out on their own kind of people. All right. So as far as foreign policy goes, Iraqi war, the Gulf War, Desert Storm, was Desert Shield, the bombing part, and then Desert Storm, the very quick, direct fighting kind of part. Very popular. And then the Soviet Union falls apart, and Bush is kind of seen as the master of foreign policy. It's like, haha, we won the Cold War, we pushed Iraq out of Kuwait, what could be better? And then when they do polls pretty regularly, you've probably noticed, about approval ratings for presidents. So they did one for Bush, and his approval rating, general approval rating, was 90%. So Democrats, Republicans alike thought he was doing a tremendous job by 91. Unfortunately for Bush, the election was in 92. So when the election year happens, we have started to lapse into a recession. So the economy starts to stink a little bit. And a lot of times, if you're the president and the economy is stinking, you are not going to get reelected. And the economy stunk in a particular and unusual sort of way, in a way that mostly harmed the entrepreneurial class. So we're talking upper middle class people who always vote, and in this era typically voted for Republicans. That is not as true now. That's more of a Democratic voting base now, but at least according to some election statistics from the last election, the one we just had. But this was typically a bunch of Republicans who would vote for Bush, and they lost their jobs and their companies failed, and they thought it was Bush's fault. So they didn't think he managed the economy well, and they weren't as concerned about his foreign policy. It's like, that's great, but I'm broke now, and I wasn't broke when you got in here. So it doesn't go well for him. Also, here's a problem for Bush. Some billionaire runs against him. You know, when those billionaires get involved in politics, it mixes us up a little. And we go like, who can we trust with the economy? How about a billionaire? They're clearly good at making money. So this fellow Ross Perot runs, and he takes more votes away from the Republican side probably than the Democrats. So you've got Bush in 92 versus Ross Perot. And Ross Perot, oh, I need to go back and talk about why the economy was bad, so apologies. But Ross Perot was a businessman from the Dallas area. He was a billionaire who made money in data management. So he's kind of in early on internet management and files and that sort of stuff. Okay. I didn't mean to skip over some Bush stuff here, so let me go back. So Bush, at the end of his first term, we have an increasing deficit, and we need, his thought is we need to address it. So people are asking, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to raise taxes? How are you going to manage this? And he says, no, I'm going to decrease spending, and we'll find a way to raise revenue. It's like, well, how can you raise revenue if you don't raise taxes? So we know you're secretly telling us you're going to raise taxes. And he says, read my lips, no new taxes. And then he ends up maybe adding a new tax or two. Now, basically, I mean, overall, he didn't really raise taxes, but I think the highest income rate earners got their taxes raised a small percent. But that was, he said no new taxes, and there were a few. As far as domestic accomplishments, the most important thing, I'm sure, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and you've probably heard about this. So it makes it, it requires businesses to, if they're already made, if they were already constructed, to modify entrances, restrooms, that sort of stuff, to make them accessible to people with disabilities, especially people in wheelchairs. So, wider doors, different kinds of bathroom stalls, that sort of thing, railings for people in wheelchairs. But also for workplaces to give reasonable accommodations to help people with disabilities to adapt to the workplace. So, like if you have trouble reading and you work on a computer, then your boss has to have text reading software or something like that. So reasonable accommodations. And it also leads to reasonable accommodations for students as well. It's where you get the 504 plans. So adaptations for people at school and work and in businesses. And almost everybody thought this was very positive. There were a few people like, dang, I don't want to spend money to retrofit my business. But as a rule, people thought that was very positive. And I think most historians would see that as easily Bush's most important domestic accomplishment. However, the economic problem, which I just said there was one, but I didn't say why, was related to a savings and loan collapse. Savings and loans were banks with slightly looser requirements for loaning money. So they were organized as a slightly different way. They had members rather than investors, and they had different rules about different looser requirements about who they could loan money to and how much. And then .com businesses, these are online businesses that had just started during this time period. So there were thousands of them, and then not everybody ran their business well, or there were difficulties. So you start to see that part of the business consolidate. So savings and loans were poorly regulated and gave bad loans that they couldn't collect, but they were insured. So then the government, i.e. the taxpayers, have to pay off their bad loans, and it's billions of dollars, so it's super expensive. And then the .com businesses, those are private, and it's not necessarily the regulation that's the problem, but these are people, because the people who started the .com businesses might have borrowed money from the savings and loans to get started. So you've got the same kind of upper middle class group of people who are harmed by both of these things, in addition to all taxpayers, of course, because that had to be paid off. So those upper middle class folks, they in that era tended to vote Republican. So the biggest loss of votes is going to be to Bush from that level of Republican voter who always vote. How sometimes younger people skip elections. These people don't skip elections. They're like old people in that way. Old people vote all the time. That's what they do. So, all right. Oh, the other thing, my goodness, I really need bigger notes, don't I? One of the guys who owned a savings and loan was a guy named Neil Bush, who might have been George Bush's son. And so that was highly publicized. And he's what they referred to in that time period as the bad Bush, because he had issues. He wasn't like George Bush, who never had any issues or maybe got over his issues, or Jeb Bush, the one who was the governor in Florida. But Neil Bush might have used cocaine, oops, and gotten caught. And he might have gotten divorced, which the Bush family didn't do. And he might have had a failed savings and loan, which cost the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he was bad for, his family's publicity. But that is not the reason they lost. But, it didn't help. It didn't help. All right, but Bush will run for re-election, and who knows? I mean, usually if the economy's bad, we don't re-elect you, but dang, people loved his foreign policy, so maybe, but no, it doesn't work out for him, does it? He runs against Ross Perot, who I already mentioned, and Ross Perot is a very eccentric billionaire. I think we have probably discovered in the modern era that eccentric and billionaire go together. Can you guys, this is where I asked for class participation. Are you ready? Ready? Can you think of any billionaires that you do not think of as eccentric? Who's the normal billionaire? Who's the not eccentric billionaire? You guys know any billionaires? Are the Kardashians billionaires? Probably not. I don't know.
You say not eccentric?
Right. Like the normal, down-to-earth billionaire.
Warren Buffett.
Yeah, probably. He hangs out somewhere in Nebraska. We don't see him. So he's like 102.
He only eats fast food.
That seems to be a theme, because that's a Trump thing as well. So maybe once you're a billionaire, you just got to eat McDonald's all the time.
Well, he owns a lot of he owns Dairy Queen and all of those. He said that the lowest age group that has the age group that has the lowest death percentage is 13-year-olds, and so he just wanted to eat like a 13-year-old.
Good call. Okay, so he's not really into science. but it's worked nicely for him. I mean, he really is pretty old. He's not 102, but I think he's in his 90s. I think. So Warren Buffett's our down-to-earth billionaire. I don't know if there are any other ones. Okay. All right, nobody else is playing along, but I appreciate you playing along. So thank you. All right, Trump, is he our down-to-earth billionaire? He may not even be a billionaire anymore. I don't know. He may just be a millionaire. I feel sad for him. All right. So Perot, he's quirky. I think he's deceased, but I honestly don't know. Isn't that terrible? But he doesn't know anything about me either, so I'm not trying to be rude. His family money, I forget the name of his company. I think it was EDS, Electronic Data Services, which was pretty big back in the day. And I think they sold to somebody. And then his son used the money to buy that land north of Dallas on the way to Denton on I-35, where they built that Alliance complex. So, yeah, I think it is probably tough for Trump to be a millionaire. Yeah. But so there's still a ridiculous amount of money in that family. Perot said some quirky things during his campaign. Mostly he talked about the economy, and he had graphs and charts, and he had kind of a high squeaky voice that people might have made fun of a little on Saturday Night Live, but again, their job. And he was a smallish sort of fellow, and he might have had, the ears were disproportionate and stuff. It was easy to, it was easy to give him a hard time. But he also said that George Bush sent the CIA to disrupt his daughter's wedding, which I'm betting didn't happen, but I don't know. He used to run the CIA, so he could have done it. But he was quirky and said some odd things from time to time, super eccentric, but also spoke pretty clearly about the economy. He's the only one of the people running who opposed NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Both Bush and Clinton thought it was a good idea. And NAFTA, of course, because we all know what NAFTA is, got rid of the tariffs between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So it opened trade. It was supposed to be kind of like an EU, European Union, but of course an American Union. Yes, an American Union. But Perot said if we did that, that all of our manufacturing jobs would go to Mexico. That's not how he said it, because he was much more colorful. He said the giant sucking sound that you heard was all of our jobs going to Mexico. So, and that was an era where we were losing manufacturing jobs already. So people in the manufacturing industries who typically were kind of middle class sort of dudes who might be likely to have been part of that Reagan coalition, they weren't going to favor this. Union workers weren't going to be in favor of NAFTA. And certainly we did lose a lot of manufacturing jobs following NAFTA. I don't know that you want to directly attribute it to NAFTA, because I'm pretty sure if we look at where the manufacturing jobs are now, they're not all in Mexico, although certainly some of them did go. They're certainly not in Canada. I don't know what people in Canada do for money. I don't think it's manufacturing. Really not sure. I would say data management, but I don't know. I've never even thought about studying Canadian economy. So, because I think I may go look that up when class is over. What's the biggest money maker in Canada? Maybe it's agriculture. I don't know. You guys look that up if you're not paying attention to me. Okay. So, Perot says no NAFTA. Bush had said no new taxes, read my lips, no new taxes, but he added a new tax. So some Republicans are going to break away from Bush and vote for Perot, which will leave just enough opening to get Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, you say? Oh, goodness. Somebody says that Canada does something with the mooses for their economy. Maybe, or they sell maple syrup or they play hockey.
I think it's oil.
Oil, there's definitely some oil. There's no doubt. Yeah, no, you're right about that. And that makes sense. Okay. Perot doesn't win. Bill Clinton wins. And did we know Bill Clinton really before 1992? He was the governor of what state? This is time for audience participation. What state was Bill Clinton the governor of? So the question is, what state was Bill Clinton the governor of?
Can I guess?
Yep.
Arkansas.
Good job. Okay, so he's
Is that right?
Yes. Good job. So he's from Arkansas, which is a very large state where millions of people, okay, not very many people live there, but it's a really important, okay, it's not even that important. Why in the world are we picking a guy from Arkansas? Because he's a good speaker, because he's young, because he's a little different. But he'll pick a vice president from a really big state, right, to get more votes. Or he'll pick Al Gore. I wonder what state Al Gore was from. Do you know who Al Gore is? Do you know anything about Al Gore? It's fine if you don't. Have you heard of him? I thought maybe because you guys are environmentalists, you have to be. Your age group, you have to be. Your job. So he wrote the documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth, that talks about the harm caused by global warming. He didn't do that before his vice presidency. And he had been a senator from the enormously populated state of Tennessee. So we picked a guy from Arkansas. Oh, look, it says it in the notes too. We should have paid attention. We picked a guy from Arkansas and a guy from Tennessee. And the push here is maybe to get back some of those voters who had gone to Reagan and Bush in the Reagan coalition, and it works a little bit. Also, Clinton is a little more conservative than the average Democrat, but not so conservative that he wouldn't appeal to young people. Gore, kind of conservative. His wife, really conservative, so she might appeal to the moral majority. Remember them? They're the churchgoers. And what Tipper Gore, that was Al Gore's wife, wanted to do was censor popular music and movies. She did. I remember that very well. It's like, why does she even care? It's really weird. But it was the beginning of that hip hop era. And sometimes, this is shocking, sometimes people would use the F word in songs or the N word when they were talking about African Americans. So people wanted to censor that just a little, because if kids heard that, their futures might be ruined. So, yeah. So that made the Democrats a little more popular with the conservative people. So either because Ross Perot took some votes away, or because Clinton was very personable, he also catered his message to younger people. So he went on television shows that he knew they would watch, like the Arsenio Hall show, or MTV back in the day when it showed music videos. And then he also played the saxophone and talked about his underwear. So he was much more approachable, seemed like an average everyday guy. And he had this very compelling story about rising from poverty in Arkansas, which is about the only thing you can do if you're from Arkansas. And I say that being from Missouri because it's kind of the same. So, you know, he had a single mom and she lived in a trailer for a while, and they had a lot of difficulties. And he ended up going to Yale and got a Rhodes Scholarship and went to wherever you go when you get a Rhodes Scholarship. I think that's Oxford, right? So highly educated, successful fellow who had risen from poverty, really good speaker, and only had a few scandalous issues, which I'm sure we will talk about quite a bit next time. Okay. Sadly, we're so close to being out of time that I probably am going to have to wrap some of this up. Clinton really emphasized the economy during his presidential run, which is why his campaign staff, every time they saw him, said, "It's the economy, stupid." And then they had that quote in his offices and that sort of stuff. So he was very focused on that in his campaign, and also very personable, seemed like your everyday, average, ordinary guy. And he won that who would you rather have a beer with kind of competition, which is sometimes a thing that they ask when people run for president. Now, no one asked that this year. And that's because neither of those guys should be having a beer. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, they're old. We don't want to cause them problems. All right, when Bill Clinton was elected, he had promised to push for universal health care, and he thought that maybe that's why he got elected, so he followed through on that push. He put his wife in charge of this plan, and it failed pretty miserably. And I'm not going to say it's because Mrs. Clinton was in charge. I think it's because it's not really why people voted for him. People thought that, you know, this would be socialist, that we would lose access to health care, there wouldn't be a good quality. And they thought that in part because the Republicans had a very good PR campaign where they put out these commercials with this guy and his wife at their kitchen table talking about how scared they were that they were going to lose access to health care if this universal health care plan got passed. Also, all your data would be in one place, and you'd have a little card with a chip on it, and then the robots would take over, or the computers, or the Russians. I don't think we are as scared of the Russians at this point, but somebody would get access to that data, and artificial intelligence would rule the world. I don't know if we were worried about that yet, but we were worried, and the Republicans make good commercials. I'll have to find a link to those commercials so you can see them in your free time, which I know you would use to look up old commercials. All right, so the healthcare thing doesn't work, and we'll talk about the welfare reform, also criminal justice reform, which will not sound much like reform to you. And we already mentioned NAFTA. NAFTA passes, it's popular with both parties, and then later on, maybe it's less popular. I don't know. You know, you would have to decide. All right. Let me see your faces, or potentially your faces again. do you guys have any questions you want to ask before we check out for the day? And don't leave just yet. Don't leave yet. I know you want to, but a lot of you came late. You owe me a minute. Don't be like that. You guys have any questions? I'm going to stop recording, which means I'm going to yell at you.